right to education and human rights. Everyone has the right to a free and public education is stated in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment allows children to attend school and prevents any discrimination. I start off my paper with talking about FAPE, which is Free Appropriate Public Education. This applies only to public schools and not private schools. With private schools, they're tuition-based, similar to college tuition, where public educations are normally not tuition-based. This mainly focuses on children with disabilities and integrating them into the general education classroom as much as possible. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights all aid in protecting students with disabilities by providing them with equal access to an education. Then I go on talking about human rights being defined as fundamental and inalienable rights, and education can be seen as a right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights promotes establishing respect for human rights and learning about how we should have a diverse society. They should develop respect for all races, religions, ethnicities, etc. Teachers are responsible for promoting diversity in their classrooms. School funding also impacts the diversity of the classroom as well as the quality of education the children receive. With little funding, the school is not going to be able to provide quality teachers nor the type of technology children may need. One of the first court cases that was a turning point for racial segregation was Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. This was the first case that really talked about racial segregation in schooling. This case deemed segregation and separate but equal from the Plessy v. Ferguson case unconstitutional. This case was what ended racial segregation in schools, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 aiding the desegregation of schools and integrating those all-white schools. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine were the first 9 teens to be integrated into an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were the first students to graduate from an all-white public high school. These two events made it possible for people of color to get an equal access to as well as a quality education. Next, talking about the court case Mills v. Board of Education in 1972. This case occurred because children with disabilities were being denied a regular public education. Thus, the verdict of this case saying that children should not be denied an education because of a disability that they have, whether that be a mental disability, a physical disability, behavioral disability, social emotional, any type of disability. This case made it possible for children with disabilities to get the kind of education they deserve. Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, known as the Mother Law, guaranteed all children from ages 3 to 21 a free and appropriate education. This law ensured the right to due process as well as included children with disabilities in the least restrictive environment in terms the general education classroom as much as possible. Now, there were levels to this called the Continuum of Special Education Services, where level 1 being the general education classroom, to level 6 being the most restrictive environment, which I believe is a residential school. As someone who struggled with with a disability my whole life, I have to say being in the general education classroom with my peers was the most effective way for me to learn. Being separated from my peers seemed to make it much, much worse. Children having the right to education can also make an impact on their social and emotional learning. Getting an education is important, but is especially essential at young ages to develop social skills that help you later in life. Without social skills, it would be harder to talk or converse with others or even get a job. With emotions, it is good to learn about the different types of emotions from a young age because a child could face a life-changing event and not know how to deal with it. In conclusion, every child should have access to education no matter what. The type of education a child receives can determine the kind of success they may have throughout the rest of their school career or the rest of their life. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment makes it possible for children to receive equal access to education as well as a quality education. Without human rights, children would most likely not have the same access to education as they do now. Since it explicitly states in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that education is a right, children have a right to an education. Now, their parents can choose what type of education they do receive, but all children have the right to a free, appropriate public education. If we do not have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I personally think that more children would not be properly educated or not educated at all. Who knows? The schools today might have been still segregated, and children with disabilities may have not been able to even go to school or have the special education services they do now that aid them throughout their education. So, in conclusion, final thoughts, human rights are very important to education. They are very fundamental rights that allow children to be able to go to school, especially in their preschool, elementary years. Education is a very essential thing to have, especially if you are wanting to progress throughout middle school and high school. It's important to start early instead of later.